And we are live once again with another episode of Frontera Radio. I am your host, Sergio Mora. We have a very interesting show lined up today with a very good friend of mine who is always, how could you say it, in the thick of things when it comes to a lot of the issues that are very in the news today and very at the very center of the debate. And he is embroiled in one of those issues right now that's on top of the news right now. And that's my friend Carlos Flores, attorney, activist, filmmaker, all-around great guy, knowledgeable guy, longtime buddy of mine, Carlos Flores. Carlos, welcome.
Thank you, Sergio. Anytime I'm hanging out with you, I know it's going to be a great conversation.
We always have good conversations, and I'm glad we managed to touch base. And I've been keeping up with this particular issue. Let's talk about that first, and then we'll continue into everything else that you've been doing over the last few years. But I mean, I'll tell you. I was on Twitter and I saw Governor Abbott tweet out, basically throw down the gauntlet, saying, "I'll see you in court." Yeah, I'll see you all the way to the Supreme Court. And I'm like, okay, who's this poor guy that Greg Abbott is going to apparently destroy in court? Yeah. And sure enough, it was my friend Carlos Flores who had sued Greg Abbott. And that has to do with a very controversial story that's going on right now. Greg Abbott with his Operation Lone Star, which is the state initiative that he has spearheaded over the last few years to secure the border. His effort to secure the border, under his opinion, the job that the federal government isn't doing, that the Biden administration isn't doing. He's made it one of his premier initiatives. And I mean, I must say, I mean, when I first saw him propose this buoy system that they apparently set up in Eagle Pass, Piedras Negras, and it's 1,000 feet long, and it's a series of buoys that rise 4 to 6 feet over the water. They're all connected, tightly connected, and underneath them there's a net that goes all the way down to the riverbed, and this is their new way to try to deter illegal immigration. And of course, Greg Abbott has been involved in building a wall, that a state-funded, state-built wall. I think they've put up containers to build a makeshift wall at some point. They've called up National Guard. They've called up National Guards from other states that happen to have Republican governors. They've all sent their National Guard down here. So, I mean, it's an extremely controversial operation in general, and it raises a lot of questions on whether should the state be involved in border security to begin with. And right now, what's most at issue is the apparent cruelty and inhumanity that a lot of these proposals entail. Mm-hmm. And that's where Carlos comes in that he is the lead counsel for a business in Eagle Pass who is directly affected by the deployment of this buoy system that Greg Abbott came up with recently. So Carlos, tell us exactly how you ended up suing Greg Abbott and Abbott calling you out on Twitter. How did that go down?
So I have been part of the No Border Wall Coalition in Laredo since 2020. Actually 2019. And we worked really diligently here to try to prevent a border wall from being built in Laredo and Webb County and Zapata County. And in the midst of that battle, I was hired by Zapata County to file a lawsuit against the President Trump at the time and the federal government at the time to prevent them from seizing property that was owned by the county in order to build a border wall. Mm-hmm. So it came out of that experience and that work that, now I've continued to do this work here at the border and really I feel like my role is part as lawyer, but also part as advocate in that, the border narrative that you hear coming out of Washington, D.C., the border narrative that you hear coming out of Austin, Texas, is disconnected to the actual reality of those of us living here at the border. And so it's through that work that, I think people sought me out and said, what do you think about these buoys, and what would be the strategy around the buoys? And so the first thing that we did was we took a look at, the statute that the governor is using to I guess do these buoys, right, and to install these buoys. And so the law that he's relying on is known as the Disaster Act of 1975, and it's a statute that has broad powers, and it has a definition of what is a disaster within the statute. And when you look at the definition of disaster in the statute, it's very clear that on the sort of like surface of it, it doesn't allow the state of Texas to create a makeshift Texas Department of Public Safety. I'm sorry, Department of Homeland Security. It doesn't allow it to do a makeshift Texas Border Patrol. It's meant to be a response to an actual disaster within the definition that is occurring.
Like a hurricane.
Like a hurricane, like a pandemic, and the key here is that there has to be either damage to property or loss of life, and that has to be the impetus for calling the disaster. Okay, so under the Disaster Act, you're required to identify the basis or the reasons for declaring a disaster, and you're also required to identify the location of the disaster. That's what's required under statute. So if you look at Governor Abbott on May 31st of 2021 issued a proclamation. And that proclamation lays out the basis for declaring a disaster. And if you look at the basis for declaring the disaster, about 80% of the statements that are in that section of the disaster declaration is just a disagreement with the federal government's policy on immigration.
Yeah.
DC is not doing their job. Biden administration is failing. Blah 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 blah.
The open borders.
Open borders. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
That is not what the Disaster Act is for. The Disaster Act is not because you disagree with the federal government on their immigration policy. And that's essentially what the governor has done, is he's taken a policy disagreement and tried to use the Disaster Act to create this makeshift Department of Homeland Security, this makeshift buoys, and all these things that they're doing. And so my client, Mr. Jesse Fuentes, is a resident of Eagle Pass. He's a lifelong Texan. And he is a sportsman, and he's a small business owner, and he is exactly what the conservatives claim to care about. Yeah. He is exactly who the conservatives claim to want to protect, right? It's like the narrative has always been, overreaching of government, government not following the law, and essentially hurting business, hurting Texans, hurting people. Well, that's exactly what the state of Texas is now doing, and Governor Abbott specifically is doing to this particular gentleman in their attempt to, not only install the buoys that they've already installed, but future buoys that they want to install. So Mr. Fuentes' claim against the governor and the state is basically two claims. The first claim is what is known as an ultra-virus cause of action, and that is essentially saying that the state agent, like this being Governor Abbott, has acted without legal authority. And the claim is that the Disaster Act does not allow him to install buoys in the Rio Grande. And that because that's true, then he's acted in an ultra-virus way by ordering the buoys to be installed there and having them installed there. And the relief that we're requesting is a permanent injunction removing the buoys from the Rio Grande, and a permanent injunction from any future buoys being put into the Rio Grande by the state of Texas. So that's kind of the issue one of the case. And then the issue two of the case is that the agencies, Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas National Guard, the Office of the Governor, that they have violated the Texas Administrative Procedures Act because they've acted outside of their delegated authority when they installed those buoys in the river. So that's essentially what the case is about. There's bigger issues regarding Operation Lone Star and things like that are also part of the lawsuit, but this lawsuit is narrowly tailored to remove the buoys from the river and keep them there permanently from being installed.
Carlos, how does one, okay, this sort of came out from left field. Did it come out from left field for you in terms of, we heard about the buoys once they were literally in the trucks waiting to be deployed, or they were already deployed. How do you come to the conclusion? How does one come to the conclusion that Abbott used these sort of this logic, these policy to pull off that action? Is there an order somewhere where, like, I'm ordering the department of this? How does that work?
Yeah, so the first step is he has to declare an emergency, a disaster.
Well, he did that in 2021, or he outlined.
He did that in 2021. On May 31st of 2021, he issued
a blanket.
He issued a proclamation. And in fact, I actually have a copy of it here for you.
Well, basically, he said the border's a mess.
He basically. Yeah, he said things like, the border. He said things like well, actually, let me read you some of what he said here. Okay. Let me see if this is the right one. No, this is not the right one. But basically, what he did was he essentially took. Well, let me actually tell you what he's doing. He with the mask mandate case.
Yeah.
So there was the mask mandates, right? And the mask mandates were essentially local governmental entities and school districts saying, we're going to require people to enter our buildings wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And so the governor sued Harris County. Oh, well, Harris County sued the governor on the attempt to try to end the mask mandates. And the mask mandates come out of the Disaster Act, right? This whole issue of the mask mandates comes out of the Disaster Act. So he used the Disaster Act to be able to undo the mask mandates locally.
Yeah.
So now he's using the Disaster Act to try to patrol and police the border like a Department of Homeland Security. So I think their playbook comes from what they did in the mask mandate case.
It's sort of emergency. It's sort of like emergency powers.
It's emergency powers, and they're trying to frame this as a declaration of disaster in sort of that emergency context, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at things like, what are the reasons for this? Here's an example. And I'm reading directly from the May 31st proclamation. He says, whereas under the Biden administration, however, the federal government has shown unwillingness, ambivalence, or inability to enforce federal immigration laws to deter and stop illegal border crossings into the United States, or to meaningfully partner with Texas in pursuing these goals. Yeah. Okay, so our argument is that statement and this idea is not something that you can use the Disaster Act for.
Yeah.
And that's basically one of the arguments, is that the statute is just being misused. This is not the statute for what he's trying to do. Yeah. And that's basically it.
Okay. And so you filed a suit in Travis County saying Governor Abbott has no right to do this. The person that you're representing, the owner of it's a kayaking
canoeing
kayaking business. Is there any language in the lawsuit saying you're hurting me?
Yes.
By ABC. What is the businessman claiming in terms of?
Yeah, he's talking in the lawsuit. He talks about events that were canceled, things that he's not able to do because of this. And in fact, right now he can't even access that area of the river because it's full of concertina wire, and you can't access it. The ramp is closed to the public, so he's basically not operating his business in that area right now. Second of all, even if, let's say, at the end of all of this, the buoys remain, I mean, it's going to be very dangerous for people to be canoeing, kayaking around those buoys, because a current could come and someone could get caught in those nets underneath the buoys and die. And so, it's just like the Disaster Act cannot give the governor the authority to essentially create another hazardous condition in order to respond to a disaster. I mean, it's just the whole concept of using the Disaster Act is just disingenuous in my view, and I think something that the courts are going to have a hard time saying, yeah, you can do this.
Well, I mean, it's classic. It's a classic authoritarian move when they assume emergency powers to be able to overrule anything that they don't like or is inconvenient to them.
And then you add on top of that it involves law enforcement, and that's another thing you can't ever. People, anytime you criticize a law enforcement operation, it's like, oh, you just hate the police, you're just anti-law enforcement. It's like, no. I personally am not anti-law enforcement. I respect the mission and the duty of the DPS. I respect the mission and the duty of the Border Patrol. They have to do their job.
Yeah.
And they have to do their job as safely and as carefully as possible. And I think that it's important to get their feedback on how they feel they can best do their job. So like, I don't want to discount any of that. Right. And that our lawsuit is not about DPS is terrible or Border Patrol is terrible or these things are terrible.
Yeah.
Our lawsuit is about, Governor, you do not have the authority to do this under the statute. And that's it. And that's basically it. And if I'm wrong, the court will explain why. And if I'm right, the court will explain why. And that's basically all we're asking for the court to do.
But Carlos, it does fall into the bigger narrative, right?
Right.
In terms of you're very clearly spelling out the mechanics of the lawsuit, saying this has nothing to do. But in the bigger narrative, it is part of just this big fight that's been had perpetually over the years, especially since the beginning of the Trump administration, when he decided that that narrative, the border is out of control, invasion, all that played out. And I mean, it's very it's very impressive and admirable, the work that has been done over the years to fight this sort of this topic that they picked, that they said this is going to be our political vehicle, this is going to be our political issue. Mm-hmm. You talk about law enforcement. It's very interesting what happened. You filed the lawsuit that had already been in motion, and then
can I comment on your comment about the narrative, though, real fast? I want to make a comment about that. I want to make a comment about that. I'm not dumb to the fact that there's a larger narrative that this case falls within.
Yeah.
And that larger narrative is the idea that the border's unsafe.
Yes.
And that is a false narrative. And it's a false narrative that is being driven by economic interests that want to build border walls, who want to sell equipment and stuff to Border Patrol agents and to DPS, like these buoys. These are all economic interests that are driving this narrative so that people and companies can make money at the expense of these people. And it's easy. They're not from here. Yeah. They're not from here. They're dangerous. They're dangerous people. And it's like, anybody who's ever been to Mexico, anyone who's ever been to South America is going to know that, these are countries that are fully developed countries, highly sophisticated countries, with great cultures, great populations, great people, and that most of these people that are coming here are because they are living in dire situations where there is no economic mobility for them, and they're doing what anybody would do if they were living in close proximity to a country that has so much economic mobility as it does. Yeah. Now, in all of my work, I've never been an advocate. I am not an advocate for the immigrants. I'm not working for the immigrants. So, my issue is not the issue of the immigrants. That has never been the approach that I've taken in my litigation or in my work. Mm-hmm. My work has always been, what does this policy impact American citizens? Yeah. Okay. For instance, under the Trump administration, the issue wasn't the border wall is bad because immigrants should be able to come in. The issue was, you are taking land from U.S. citizens. You're seizing U.S. citizens' land. Mm-hmm. For a policy that is not going to work, and for a policy that is, in our view back then, was that it was unconstitutional, because it was essentially targeting people based on their race, based on their color, based on their nationality, based on their national origin, and seizing my land, seizing our land, Texans' land, to promote that policy. And so we argued, and I continue to argue, and I think it's correct, that this violates equal protection clauses of both the Fifth Amendment when we're talking about the feds, and the 14th Amendment when we're dealing with the state, right? And so the good thing about all of this, like, there's always a positive in these situations, is that now, today, the border is responding. It is responding. We have people in Eagle Pass that are organizing now and saying, we are not going to allow this narrative to continue. We did that in Laredo. The Valley's getting organized. El Paso's getting organized. These communities are getting organized, and they're saying, we're not going to take this anymore. We're not going to be a political punching bag for some other state that has no idea what they're talking about, has no idea where we are or who we are. And just to get that person's vote, they're going to use some rhetoric that is going to have a real impact in where we live.
Of course.
And so that is the great thing that's happened by all of this. Which is that we are now saying, hey, hold on. We are going to tell you who we are. You're not going to tell us who we are anymore. And that is happening. And it's happening through art. It's happening through film. It's happening through this lawsuit. It's happening through other lawsuits. It's happening through organizing in these communities. And, you know, it's something that has brought us to life. And you know what? We're not going to be the same again. Like this region, like the history of the border has always been, we're neither American enough or we're neither Mexican enough. And that has always been the narrative around the border communities. Yeah. And I say, let's drop that narrative. We don't have that narrative. That's a false narrative. The right narrative is the border is its own place. It's unique. It's different. You know, what we expect and live with here may be different from what you would expect and live with in another place, but we're comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. You know, we're comfortable living in the border. We're comfortable with it. You know, we feel safe, you know, and we are some of the safest communities in the United States, you know, and that's why I come back to this thing that we're not against Border Patrol. We're not against DPS. We're not against law enforcement, because we understand that law enforcement is why it's safe here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, definitely.
That's why it's safe here, right? And so there's no question. But here's the thing. How much safer do you want it to be? I mean, Laredo is already in the top 10 safest cities in the state, and it's already one of the top 20 safest cities in the country. Is that not enough? Do we need to go to number one? Is that what's motivating this? Of course, that's not what's motivating this. What's motivating this, Sergio, is economic interests that need these policies so that they can benefit from those policies. And that's the problem. You know, if this was a sincere effort to help the border communities, if this was a sincere effort to stem immigration, illegal immigration, this would not be what you would be doing. This would not be what you'd be doing. You'd be doing other things. You would be investing in these communities so that they can have access to mental health resources. You'd be investing in these communities so that they have after-school programs to try to prevent drug use and drug addiction and gangs and things like that. And you would, you know, have policies that are different for Mexico and Latin America so that people who need to come here have a way to come here in an organized manner.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything you've been saying, but at the same time, it's obvious. You say that. I mean, I guess you could call it a border security industrial complex, in that it's big business, and walls are big business, and the equipment and the technology and the
prison
drones
and the prisons
and all that
holding facilities and the money to the government, local governmental entities.
It's huge business, and like the saying goes, follow the money.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a huge political boon for especially the Republicans, the conservatives, in that you brought up a very salient point: the narrative of us versus them. Yeah. And they're very blatant about it in a lot of their media outlets, in that they're talking about the great replacement theory, and that they want to replace us, and you'll hear it from people here in Laredo. Is like, yeah, well, the Democrats want open borders because the immigrants end up becoming citizens and voting Democrats. That's the rationale, and it's ludicrous, but that's the narrative that they push. In the media outlets. And you have the dynamic of, and especially in a state like Texas, where the Republicans have overwhelming political control, in that the general elections aren't as important as the primary elections. So when you're running in an election where only Republicans vote, usually the more extreme Republicans have the advantage, because more militant kind of voters come out in primaries. And I think that's why Texas has some of the leaders, the far right leaders that it does. But in terms of them very hypocritically using this issue politically so that they can win Republican primaries, and not only win Republican primaries, but appeal using fear.
Yeah.
And cherry picking incidents and cherry picking images.
Yeah.
To paint this narrative of this invasion, of this lawlessness, of this chaos. It's extremely cynical, because I don't think it reflects the reality. But at the same time, you fall into a problem where our side is seen as, we don't think there's a problem at all.
Yeah, and well, see, the thing the thing is, I'm also very critical of the Democrats.
Yeah,
I think they've completely dropped the ball on this.
Okay, how so?
Well, I'll tell you the reason I feel like they completely dropped the ball on this is, first of all, you know that people are going to come to this country when you start to change the Trump policies, like the Title 42 stuff, right?
Yeah.
You knew that there was going to be a huge influx of people coming, you know. And so for me, like the federal government, like right now, the Democrats, like where they have failed is that they also use this for a political tool, right? They're, you know, the racist narrative of the Republicans, or the racist narrative of the Republicans, right? Let's bring up our base. Let's get our base. But yet there's no solution. Right. Yeah. And like, I'll give you an example of what a solution would look like. Okay.
So you have to accept there's a problem in order to have a solution.
And I think Democrats do accept that there's a problem. The thing is that they don't, they do see that there's a problem, but they would rather try to make the Republicans look bad than come up with a solution.
But at the other end, if the Democrats instinctively are against any sort of effort to secure the border, any sort of new effort to secure the border, doesn't that feed into their narrative? I'm like, look, the Democrats are against absolutely anything we try to do to secure the border.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. The problem is that, like, are we trying to win elections?
Yeah.
Or are we trying to solve the problem? Because those are two different questions, and those are going to have two completely different answers.
Yes.
If it's about winning elections, then let's just keep doing what we're doing, because that's what this has been about.
Yeah.
This has been about winning elections. Now, let me say this. There are definitely some Democrats that like have really stepped up and have really done a good job on this issue. One of them is Veronica Escobar, the congresswoman out of El Paso. Okay, so I don't want to paint all Democrats together, because there are some good Democrats.
Okay? But I want to be clear about that. The thing is in the national image, in the media narrative, what is the image that ends up being? Look at the Democrats.
But to me, I feel like the solution is like simple. Like, and usually solutions are usually very simple.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a need in the United States for workforce.
Yeah.
That our citizens are not willing to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's identify what those needs are, right? And then identify how many people from Latin American countries or from wherever are going to be able to come in and do these jobs, okay? And come up with a system that is organized and orderly for them to come into the country, do their work, go back to their country when they're not doing the work, all of that stuff. But, I mean, that's what they need to do. I mean,
but that would require cooperation in Congress.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. I'm talking about the federal government solving this problem, right? Exactly. Okay, but and then at the same time, simultaneously, right, is implementing policies that try to attack the drugs, attack the drug use. But that's not going to be border walls and tanks. Yeah. That's going to be places where people have the opportunity to get help to recover from their addiction.
Yeah.
So that way you begin to attack what is really the cause, the initial cause of this entire problem, which is the use in the United States.
Of course.
Okay. If you're not attacking use in the United States, then you're not talking about drug war. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry. If you're not talking about fixing the using problem in the United States, you're not talking about solving the problem. If you're not talking about helping people come here and work legally and be able to a system where they can come and leave legally, then you're not talking about solving border security. You're just talking about winning the next election.
You're just talking about putting on the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Need.
Yeah, exactly.
For political reasons.
Exactly.
Let's at the same time, we have seen here in our community just an increase in the amount of stash houses that get busted. There's been an extreme upsurge in these high-speed chases.
Yeah.
That end up, in many instances, very tragically. You see the images of them opening trailer beds and having 150 people stuffed inside.
That's terrible. It's
like sardines.
Yeah.
You see. So it becomes a very difficult argument to defend in terms of saying that there's not really a big problem going on in our communities.
Definitely a problem.
A lot of our youth are involved in trafficking the migrants. In that, I saw a very impactful picture of a van that they were selling at some lot, and it said it holds 10 migrants. Like it was being marketed to migrant smugglers. You know,
right.
That's and I mean, you know that I'm into the politics a lot, and I would love for one day the Democrats to win statewide in Texas again. But I see this as an issue where we're dropping the ball in that we're not very careful in terms of saying, no, we are for border security. We're for strong border security. We're just against these individual efforts.
Policies. Yeah, these policies that are not going to work. Well, let me give you an example of something that most people don't know, and it's very alarming to what I'm about to tell you. In 2020, the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Homeland Security issued an audit that was evaluating the Trump administration's policy on border walls. And this OIG report, which was during the Trump era, so this was a Trump era OIG report. This is not a Biden era report now looking back. This was during the Trump administration, someone who was a Trump appointee who was overseeing this. Yeah. And that study basically said that, or that audit said that DHS and CBP had not done their job to determine whether or not border walls would even be useful where they were proposing them. It turns out this study found that they were relying on studies that had been done in 2008 under the Bush administration. Yeah. Okay. And of those 2008 studies, they were only able to access about 35% of them. And of the 35% of them that they accessed, none of them talked about where geographically the border walls would be built and why they would be built there. So basically the entire policy on these border walls by the federal government under the Trump administration was done because some guy had an idea, as opposed to how you're supposed to do it when you're trying to, figure out whether it's the right policy or not, which is that you vet the policy. You actually do the work that the law requires you to do to be able to determine whether or not this policy is going to work or not work, and then justify the expense. Of course. The exact same thing is happening in Texas. Because I'll tell you what, if the federal government was not doing their job back during the Trump administration on this border wall stuff, what work is the state doing on determining whether or not these things work or don't work, or what's the impact of these things or not, the impact on these things? First of all, they're not competent to do it. Why? Because they're not there's not one agency within the state that is tasked with border security. Yeah. Why? Because that power resides with the federal government. That's why. You know what I'm saying? So to use the Disaster Act to create a quasi sub-agency that is essentially the Texas Department of Homeland Security is just really conceptually wrong, because they don't have the capacity to do it. They don't have the way to evaluate and analyze it. And then most importantly, which is what our case is about, is that they don't have the law to do it. They're not authorized to do this. So, these are the kinds of decisions that are being made at the highest level that are going to have a permanent impact on places where you and I live, where our river, the only source of drinking water that you and I and the millions of people that live in this region, rely on to drink. And these guys are playing with that, and we were in drought conditions last summer.
Yeah.
We were in drought conditions last summer. Like, this is a very sensitive ecological area. You can't just, I'm just, what can help me win my election this time? Okay, well, I'm gonna go put a barrier in the river.
Well, and you bring a really good, you bring up a really good point in that. Well, also, and the Wall Street Journal published a very good report on Friday, and it's saying basically Operation Lone Star is a failure, and they cite the numbers of arrests that they make of immigrant encounters that they have, and it's 1% of the amount that the Border Patrol has during the same period of time. Yet this operation was allotted $5 billion for the past biennium, including the current, and it's allotted $5 billion more for the next 2 years. Yeah. So they're doubling down on it as if it was effective. Yeah. In terms of fixing the problem, but it is
effective. It's effective. It's effective in that conservatives. It's effective in that it's solidifying the Republican base.
Exactly. That's what's effective. But it's not effective towards solving the problem.
Yeah, it's effective. No, but see, the thing is, it's like, that's what we have to stop doing though. Like, see, and this is the problem that I think we have, is that we want to talk about it in one context, but it's really happening for a completely different context. Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, and I'm not talking about my case here. I'm talking about the larger narrative. My case is a different thing. We're just talking about the narrative here. In terms of the narrative, right? Let's have the actual conversation, which is that you're doing this simply to get votes. You're doing this simply to give sweetheart contracts. That's what you're doing this for.
Yes.
You're doing this to feed your donors, and you're doing this to feed your political base. And that's all this is about.
The red meat.
The red meat. This has nothing to do with border security. It has nothing to do with any of these things.
Correct.
Because if it had anything to do with border security, then you would actually figure out what to do.
Yeah. And the numbers would reflect
And the numbers
progress.
would reflect it. And you would have a good, it's like, let me tell you, when you know a good idea, everyone's like, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Right. And then when something's a bad idea, you're like, oh my God, that's a terrible idea. Yeah. And that's what's happening here. So, it's like we're living in this very strange period of time where, nothing is really what it is.
Yeah.
Those buoys are not to stop immigrants.
Yeah.
Those buoys, 1,000 feet of buoys on the Rio Grande is not going to stop one immigrant.
Yeah.
Not one. Okay.
Well, it just makes it harder, and that means that the people who charge for smuggling are going to be able to charge more.
Yeah.
For the crossing.
Yeah.
And they're just going to go around them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in terms of the larger narrative, in terms of saying, you know what, they're against absolutely everything that, because what in politics, it matters of the people that aren't the vast majority of people aren't really paying attention to the details that we just talked about,
Yeah.
They're paying attention as to the little tiny glimpses that they get of stuff on the news.
Something on their news feed.
Yeah,
they don't even
on the news feed.
They don't even read the article. They see the news feed.
Something on the news feed. And I made this point before, in that after a while it starts being like, well, these type of people are always offering solutions, and these other type of people just don't want absolutely anything done. Mm-hmm. And then they lay the accusation of, look, the Democrats want open borders. Look, we try to do it. We try to do it. Yeah. And they don't want anything. They throw it back at us. And I think that has hurt the Democrats. Yeah. I think that in Texas has stuck in that ever since we started fighting against Trump's wall, we have just been seen as being against absolutely any sort of effort, period, to secure the border. Yeah. And that's not obviously true, because, if you look at a lot of the biggest outlays for the expansion of Border Patrol and funding the Border Patrol, it's been Democratic administrations. Yeah. And now Abbott is saying that, pretty much he's saying that the Border Patrol isn't doing their job, when during the Trump administration, the Border Patrol was held up, up high as a model, So it's all messed up. It's all over the place. It's not coherent. Yeah. But in my opinion, we've created a big problem for ourselves.
You're talking about the Democrats?
About the Democrats in general, and everybody who's in our big tent.
I think the Democrats. I think this is an opportunity for a solution.
Yeah.
I think that this is an opportunity for a group of people to come together and offer a real solution. Unfortunately, because this whole conversation about the border and immigrants is not about solutions, it's about economic interest and about political interest, it will probably never be solved, because it's designed, I think, in my view, it's designed to not work. It's designed to remain a chaotic situation. It's designed to do that. It's designed to do that because people make money if it's like that.
Yeah.
We
were talking about the buoys, but what's been in the news a lot, because after you filed your suit, after the buoys were deployed, there was a DPS officer who is tasked to the operation, who's down there, up there in Eagle Pass, who wrote a letter, an email that was acquired by the Houston Chronicle, where he says that he was ordered, that they are being ordered to not give immigrants any water, to turn back children that are trying to get across the concertina wire. Yeah. There was a story about a pregnant woman who had who lost the baby while she was stuck in this concertina wire. But overall, you get the culture of cruelty and dehumanization of the immigrants. And I mean, I know a lot of DPS officers. I know a lot more of Border Patrol officers and some of the best people that you'll meet. But at the same time, you constantly hear about elements that about this sort of like culture that is out in the field. I know that, like, for example, I read somewhere that the Border Patrol calls the immigrants tonks because that's the sound make when they hit them with those big mag light on the head. That's the sound that they make, and that's what they call them. So I mean, you do get after a while this sort of I'm not saying everybody. I'm not saying all the agents. I'm not saying, but you do get this cruelty, this dehumanization of the migrants.
Yeah, I'll say this to you, and I think it's very important. This is an example of how, if you're a person of color and you're poor, the power in control is going to treat you one way, differently from how they treat people who are not of color or who are not poor. And that's what this is showing. This is the cruelty. The reason these people are having to live through these indignities, and I'm talking about the migrants that are crossing, is not only the indignity of living in a society and in a culture where they do not have economic ability to move up, but these are people that are coming here also because they want to create a better opportunity for their families, and they're trying to avoid having their children go to cartels. They're trying to avoid, having their families killed because of cartels or things like that, right? And so these people are having to flee like very desperate situations that anybody would flee.
Of course.
And then they come to what, when you and I were growing up, we grew up with the belief that America was the greatest country in the world, that it would always do the right thing, that it would always, if there was a humanitarian problem, if there was some injustice in the world, you could always rely on the United States to come in and be the adult and be mature. And now, present day United States, you can't say that anymore. You can't say that. Right now, the state of Texas, through this policy, Operation Lone Star, and specifically through those buoys and the Concertina wire that's along the border in that area, is creating the problem. They're creating a problem, and it's a very dangerous one. And it's cruel, and it's inhumane. And we as a country should be better than that. And we as a state should be better than that. And it's unfortunate that we're not. It's unfortunate that that's where things have come now.
You talk about, I mean, the immigration problem, I think, is only going to get worse just look at this past month in terms of the climate, and imagine what a month of this kind of climate does to countries that were not in good shape to begin with in terms of just their food supplies and water supplies. And so you and a lot of these countries, I mean, they've been overtaken by the criminal element. The rule of law has broken down. So you get a lot more. But you also have the situation where these immigrants are enticed by smuggling operators, by the people that end up advertising. They advertise on social media, WhatsApp groups, saying it'll cost you X amount and we'll get you from point A to point B. And so you have what I'm getting at is you have the immigrants in terms of the two narratives, in that they are leaving a desperate situation for a better life. And you have to respect that, obviously. But at the same time, they're a product. They're a product that is being trafficked.
A commodity, just like anybody else.
Just like drugs.
Yeah, just like toilet paper.
Yeah, they're being trafficked.
Yeah.
And these obviously smuggling networks are very sophisticated. And they're very abusive towards the migrants in terms of a lot of these end up in virtual.
A guest worker problem solves all that. A guest worker problem solves all that in 1 second. 1 second. You have a reason. You need to come to this country for a reason. We will give you a vehicle for doing it, and then they can go do it. They go to the consulate. They do the paperwork. They wait. They come. They're here legally. We can monitor them. We can track them. We know when they leave the country. That solves all of those problems. But nobody wants to solve that problem that you're talking about.
But what I'm getting at is the terms of we say, man, this all these measures are wrong. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if you don't look at it as trying to stop the immigrants, but you're trying to stop these smuggling networks.
Yeah.
Does that not justify it a little bit more?
No, not at all. Because see, the smuggling, again, that's the thing. Again, I come back to the question. What is the question we're asking, right? Are we asking, how do we stop people from having to cross illegally at the between the ports of entry?
Or how do we stop people being crossed by criminal organizations?
Okay, and I come back to the same thing. Create a system that allows people to go to the U.S. consulate. There's a mechanism that allows them to come to this country. That is a different.
Asylum.
That is no, not asylum. It's a different. Like, in other words, there's going to be situations where you have people who want to work.
Yeah.
Okay, let's create a system for them. Okay, and that's going to be based on the country's needs, the United States needs, right? Like, what are our needs as a country? Okay, and then you move on and you say, okay, and now how about people that are in war-torn areas or areas where there's high criminality? The asylum seekers. Okay, let's create that system so that it is efficient and safe. What the Trump administration did was they said, okay, you have to stay in the country that is the first country that's next to the country that you crossed into. So that was the stay in Mexico policy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but what ended up happening at the stay in Mexico policy, which is something that a lot of people don't talk about, is that in communities like Brownsville, for instance, where across the river they were in Matamoros, there was
horrible situations,
deplorable situations. People being raped, people being killed, people having to go through the winter with very little shelter. That's just as bad. It's just equally terrible. If not, it's worse. And so I think I come back to this thing, and it's like, let's stop fighting over the things that we are fighting about, and let's actually try to solve these problems. But the thing is, again, they're not going to be solved. Why? Because the economic interests that are behind these things benefit economically by you doing this.
Well, they're not going to be solved because if any Republican in Congress says, you know what, I want to sit down with the Democrats and come up with real solutions to this. Yeah. They'll be voted out of office.
Yeah, exactly.
By the next election.
Exactly, because again, this is the second reason why they're doing this is because it's just to win elections.
Yeah. No, but not only to win elections, but not to lose your seat.
Yeah.
When you're seen to be cooperating with the enemy in the new culture in Washington. I mean, you saw.
Well, it's not even a new culture anymore. It's
an old
culture now. It's an old culture now. It's the only culture now that we know.
But you saw, like, there was a gang of 4, a gang of 8, Marco Rubio and like a bunch of other senators who said, you know what, we're gonna do comprehensive immigration reform, which is what's needed. Yeah. And immediately their own party just crucified them, and they backed off.
Here's a primary opponent.
They backed off quick. Yeah. And they've never attempted it again. Yeah. And they won't. Yeah. I mean, look at the new Congress.
And who's losing? We are. American citizens living at the southern border are the ones that are losing. Yeah. The reason American citizens at the border are losing is because we're the ones whose property is being seized. We're the ones whose water is being impacted or threatened. Yeah. We're the ones who have to live with this militarization of the border. We're the ones that are suffering. Forget the migrants. Yeah. Okay, and I'm not saying forget the migrants. Obviously, their plight is very important too. Yeah. But let's say that doesn't resonate with you at all. Mm-hmm. What about the American citizens that are living on the U.S. side that are being impacted by all this? Yeah. Do you care about them?
Yeah, of course.
You know what I'm saying? And that's my counter to this whole narrative.
I mean, I agree. Everything you've talked about and all the efforts that have been made, I agree with. Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, how do you thread the needle in terms of us saying at the same time we believe in you said it yourself. Why do these people are leaving these countries where there's no rule of law and coming here? Well, what differentiates this country is exactly the respect for the rule of law.
Exactly.
Something you don't find in those other countries. You know?
Exactly.
In that if you break the law, it doesn't matter who you are.
Yeah. Like no one is above the law in the United States.
You're going to get popped, you know?
No one is above the law in the United States. And I really believe that. That is true.
But at the same time, you have a system where an immigration system where it sort of seems that you are rewarded if you don't do it according to the law, if you don't do it according to the book, if you try to do it illegally. And yes, the immigration system is messed up in terms of, for a migrant, it's a lot easier and cheaper and more convenient to do it illegally because the legal way is so messed up. Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, when this country's based on the rule of law and respect for the rule of law, this specific area is sort of grayish in that the rule of law doesn't apply how it should.
Because we're dealing with people of color who are poor. When we're dealing with people of color who are poor.
Like, okay, you said it, and I'm playing. We're just exploring the issues very robustly. I don't necessarily agree with everything, but in terms of looking at it from all angles, asylum seeking, which has been one of the biggest issues. Yes, these people are leaving wretched conditions. There's no doubt. There's no Central America. I mean, there's a lot of these places can be certainly considered failed states, or at least failed regions, in that the power of the state doesn't even apply in a lot of these regions that these people are coming under. But at the same time, how genuine is their, okay, yes, you're coming from a wretched place, but I don't think that you would qualify for asylum based on the specific guidelines that are laid out in terms of you to be granted asylum. And the numbers reflect that. The numbers, I mean, in terms of how many asylum cases are approved by immigration judges is a tiny amount compared to the amount of people that applied for them. Right. And you get a situation where people come and instead of turning themselves at the port of entry for asylum, they cross illegally. Yeah. And then when they're caught, they claim asylum. Yeah. Meaning that wasn't their original intent.
Yeah, they're gaming the system.
But it's a very convenient.
Yeah, if people are gaming the system, that's unacceptable. Like, in other words, I want to be clear about that. Okay. Gaming the system is unacceptable. Okay, like if you have a system in place and you have to follow it, you have to follow it, right? If you're going to seek asylum. Yeah. Okay. So, like, at no point am I saying that these people should not follow the law. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, are the laws and the policies in place truly benefiting the United States? In other words, would we benefit from a reform of these laws so that it would allow these people to come, that need to come here, when we have an economic interest that will be benefited from them being here?
And that's always.
Yeah, and that's always. So let's just create a policy around that. Yeah. Let's create a real policy around that. You know, and the thing about it is like this, it's like, but we're Americans. We're the United States. Why should we do that? Well, the reason that we should do that is because we are the number one consumers of all of the drugs that are being made in those countries that you're talking about. Yeah. And we are the number one consumers of those drugs that those cartels are shipping here. And we're the number one consumer of those drugs that those cartels are killing people for. And we're the number one consumers of those drugs that cartels are crossing people illegally as part of their operation. So we have a role to play in the conditions that are happening in these countries. Oh, and for us to turn a blind eye to them is terrible.
Well, not only that, I mean, and yes, the consumption of drugs is what funds these organizations that end up destabilizing these countries, that cause massive displacement of people wanting to leave. Yes. But also, I mean, where they get their weapons is the United States of America.
It's not Venezuela. They're not getting their weapons from Venezuela. They're not getting their weapons from Cuba.
Do you know where they get them from? From
Texas.
From the great state of Texas.
The great state of Texas.
Yeah, exactly. So you have gun laws that allow criminal organizations from neighboring countries to come in and buy unlimited amounts of weapons of war that they then take back to their countries. And I mean, in terms of like the irrationality of anybody being able to buy more than one M16 at a time. I mean, you can make the argument that like no one needs one.
Yeah.
But the fact that like straw purchasers can walk into gun shows and buy unlimited amounts of weapons of war to fuel that conflict and many others around the world is just in terms of like what's causing the environment that's triggering the illegal immigration that you hate so much.
So who benefits from this, right? It's like it goes back to, it's like who benefits from the cartels? The gun companies.
The gun companies.
They benefit. They're selling their guns to them.
Exactly.
Directly.
Yeah, completely.
And how come they're not being indicted? How come they're not being brought forward to account for what their role is in all of this?
Mexico sued them, but I don't know what ended up happening with that lawsuit. It didn't obviously get anywhere.
And this is the negative of the United States. Like the United States has some negatives. And one of the negatives in the United States.
Well, they're huge negatives.
Yeah. And one of the huge negatives of the United States is the fact that our politics today is mostly governed by economic interests.
Of course.
Mostly governed by economic. There's some things that maybe not, but the vast majority of our politics is driven by economic interests, and they manipulate people into believing things that are either not accurate or not completely true in order to justify them to go vote so that they can continue to have the policies that allow them to make money. And so, like, I'll give you a perfect example. President Trump, when he was running for president, he landed in Laredo and literally called the mayor and asked him, is it safe for him to get off the plane?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, in his mind, he perceived that it was so dangerous in Laredo, Texas, that he would have to call the mayor to see if he could get off the plane. Like, that's ridiculous. Yeah. And there's so many people that are going to go out and vote in the midterms or in the next presidential election that have that kind of idea in their mind, and they're trying to do the right thing when they go vote. In their mind, they're thinking they're going and doing the right thing, right? I'm going to go save the border, but I'm going to go vote for this. I'm going to save people's lives by doing this. Yeah. Come sit down in Laredo and you find out, like, it's quiet town, safe town, great place to raise your kids, and it has nothing to do with this kind of narrative, that you're hearing,
Completely.
Yeah. So,
I think that we've explored the immigration topic extensively, and ultimately, I mean, we arrive at the solution that the solution is there, but it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Yeah. But I mean, I think at the same time, for example, these measures adopted by the Biden administration have been very effective in terms of like the app, the making an appointment before you show up.
Yeah, streamlining the process.
Streamlining the process and all these. They've been criticized by immigration activists, but they've had results in that when they lifted Title 42, the expected avalanche of people never materialized. Yeah. And now the ironic thing when you take into consideration Greg Abbott's efforts in Inigo Pass are that numbers dropped dramatically because of a result of the actions that Joe Biden's administration took recently. Yeah. And that gets lost in the noise. In that you don't see that as much as you see the concertina wire and you see the buoys and you see Greg Abbott and you see so there's ways to better the situation, and I think that they're being done by an administration that's genuinely honest about trying to fix the situation. But with Trump running again, this I mean, we're back for some more demonization of the border, and this issue is going to be blown up like crazy.
The good thing is that this time we're ready.
Well,
this time we're ready. Before we weren't ready, but now we're ready. We got ready. We got ready under the Trump administration, and now we're ready. And you know what? The federal government has a lot of power. The state has a lot of power. But you know what? People have power too.
With that I'll segue into another topic that I want to talk to you about, because one of the tools in your arsenal it's extremely important to transmit the message in a way that people will understand, because they're complex issues. There's a lot of stuff that's under the surface that needs to be taken into account.
Yeah.
And that brings me into you started making films about this. Yeah. I mean, all the efforts, it's been lawsuits, it's been rallies, it's been marches, it's been meetings. It's been just this whole big movement that arose.
Yeah.
That's kept itself very busy with you being at the forefront, certainly in the legal realm of it, and also as a spokesman. You decided to make a movie, a documentary out of that called The Southern Front.
Yeah.
That ended up being very successful, being shown at film festivals and winning awards.
Yeah.
And you took off, and you are currently producing another one called Across.
Across, yeah.
Which I think that the concept is fascinating.
Yeah.
So which one do you want to start with? And, and obviously about your decision to go down that path in general.
Yeah. Well, let me just make one comment about Across, and then I'll cut back to the whole general idea. The villain in the film Across, the movie Across, is about it becoming very unsafe on the Mexican side of the border.
Yeah.
Okay. And the story tracks 3 individuals who grew up in Laredo and talks about their experiences in going to Nuevo Laredo when they were young and going to eat at restaurants, going to party, going to shop, things like that. And so it tells their story. And it's a story about how basically when you grew up on the border, that was essentially what every parent, your parents did it, your grandparents did it, your great-grandparents did it. It was just part of the culture here, was that eventually one day you were going to go to Nuevo Laredo or go across and you were going to have that experience. So that's what the story's about, right? It's about that period and about how that period came to an end. Interestingly enough, the villain in the movie is not the cartels, which is what most people would think. Most people think, okay, well, it's because the cartels, they can't go across anymore. Well, no, that is a part of it. But the actual villain in the movie is something known as Plan Mérida, which was a joint plan between the United States and Felipe Calderón's administration.
The Mérida Initiative.
The Mérida Initiative to militarize the war on drugs in Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay, now see, here's the thing. We talk about the war on drugs in the United States, and we talk about it in language like, oh, it's this terrible policy. It's targeted people of color, communities of color, and it absolutely has done that.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of the impact on the war on drugs in the U.S. has been losing rights. Either you've been imprisoned unfairly or you lost some kind of right that you had. But when we go talk about it in Mexico, we're actually talking about a real war with tanks, with guns, with the Mexican military openly fighting warfare. Black Hawk helicopters in the streets. Yeah. Okay. And that has completely destabilized parts of the northern part of the Mexican border, which now makes it almost impossible for people to go there, okay, and enjoy it the way that we had enjoyed it for generations before. And so that's what the documentary is about. It's about analyzing the impacts of the Mérida Initiative on the southern side of the border and how that has basically destroyed a culture here in the Mexican-U.S. border.
That's fascinating,
yeah.
And I mean there are serious mistakes in how this war has been sort of formulated and executed. Yeah. And I'll give you an example, and it's very well known. It's called the kingpin strategy, where they go after the heads of these organizations. Yeah. And although that looks great on the news in terms of you do your perp walk and everybody's like, oh, progress.
We all feel better.
Yeah, progress. We got this guy, We
got Chapo.
Yeah. What ends up happening and what has happened is that these organizations just end up splintering into more organizations.
Yeah.
One organization ends up being 2 or 3.
Yeah, and it becomes more violent because they're fighting within themselves.
Where they're fighting within themselves. And now you have geographical areas where all these splinter organizations are battling it out. And that's what causes the situation that we live under.
Yeah.
So no, I think that's fascinating. Yeah. When are you going to
that movie's going to be done probably by the end of August, and it'll be we're going to start the film festival circuit, and so we're going to submit it to South by Southwest and several like basically some of the major film festivals, and we're hoping to compete well in those films. Now the Southern Front The Southern Front is a documentary.
That was your first one?
The first one was the Southern Front. Yeah. And Across, we just talked about Across. Now I'm going to go back to Southern Front. The Southern Front is a short 45-minute documentary that tracks the story of how the people in Laredo came together to stop Trump's wall from being built here. Yeah. And that film came out in about 10 film festivals, and it won a third place at the World Film Festival in Houston, which is the largest independent film festival in the country, and it's actually the original independent film festival. And so we were able to get an award there. So we were very lucky to do that on our first attempt.
That's awesome,
at our first attempt. So we're hoping to learn the lessons from the first film and now bring an even more sophisticated film that is going to be able to compete at a larger level and really, explain what's happening. And I think to me, like, that's the point. Like, it's like, every society and every place has the opportunity to define itself, and it has the opportunity to create art around itself and to basically develop its story and its contribution to humanity. And I think that's what we're doing with our films. That's what we're doing with our activism. That's what we're doing with our organizing. That's what we're doing with our artists that are here at the border that are now speaking out and creating art against these narratives. And it's actually probably the best thing that could have happened for the border, because I think prior to Trump, we were pretty much asleep. Like, nobody messed with us, especially in Laredo. Nobody really messed with us. We were kind of an economic, kind of powerhouse in the region, with our banks, with our port, with our industry here, and really no one ever thought that there would ever be this kind of like, border walls in Laredo or things like that. Like, that's just something that we never thought would come here, and when it came, it's like, wait a minute. These are not, you're not messing with the Mexican Americans of, prior generations. Like, we're educated. We're not going to mess around. We know the system. We know the way it works. We're standing on the shoulders of the giants before us who fought these civil rights battles. But now we're much more sophisticated. Now we have economic power. Now we have political power. And most importantly, we've got great lawyers who can go and fight, and that's what we've been able to do. And it's been wonderful.
Tell me how you arrived at that decision. Number one. Was it something you've always wanted to do?
To make films?
To make films, and why? How did the idea to make that particular film, The Southern Front, how did that come about? And just tell us what the process entails.
Sure.
To begin with, how do you think about, like, okay, I'm gonna get footage of this? Yeah. You go out there, or do you react? Do you how does it work?
Okay, so great question. I have always wanted to be a filmmaker. In fact, that was my original dream for myself, was that I would be a filmmaker, a storyteller. I would say that that's what I do. If you ask me, what do I do for a living? I basically look at situations and figure out what they're really about, and then find a way of presenting them in the way that they make the most sense and creates the most clarity. Okay. And I call that storytelling. Okay. And so what I realized when I was in my early 20s was that I really didn't know anything. And so I really didn't have any stories to tell or movies to make because I didn't know anything. And so I said, let me go get a profession first. Let me become a professional in something. Let me learn something. Let me get some real life experience. Yeah. And then I'm going to come back to this and see what I can do. So that was when I made the decision. Instead of continuing to try to be a filmmaker, I said, let me go to law school, and I became a lawyer, and I went to UT, and I was in Austin for 3 years. And then I moved to El Paso, and I was in El Paso for about 5 years. And then I moved back to Laredo in 2009, and I've been here since 2009. And in whenever it was that President Trump announced that he was declaring a national emergency at the border, that was when this issue of the border stuff came to me and said, hey, like, we'd like for you to be in part. Can you help us? So then I got involved legally, right? And I did my work as a lawyer, and I did my work as an organizer. So then the pandemic comes, and I think, man, you could die from this pandemic. And this was a thought I had early on before we really knew how dangerous this pandemic was. And I thought, man, you could die, and you're going to die, and you never made a film. That was your dream. That was what you really wanted to do with your life.
That brought it home for you.
Yeah, that brought it home. Yeah. So I said, you know what? I'm sitting on a great film here. Like I'm living a movie. I'm living a movie with this work that I'm doing at the border. And so a friend of mine named Patricio Salinas, who's a filmmaker, he's from Laredo originally, but he's a professor at a university in Louisiana. And I said, hey, I have this idea for this documentary. Would you like to do it? And he said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And so we did it. And so the way that it started was that I had a clear beginning, and I had and then I had a clear ending. And the beginning was that I wanted to bring everyone who wasn't from the border to the border. So the movie opens with a drone shot at that rest stop right outside of Cotula. You know how when you're leaving Cotula and you're coming to Laredo, there's like a little rest area?
The LaSalle County.
The LaSalle County rest area. Okay. That's where the movie opens, with a drone shot there, because I always love that curve. There's like this curve that happens there, and then that's when you start to go towards Laredo. And that curve takes you towards Laredo, right? So the movie opens there at that curve, and then I bring the audience into the city of Laredo, and then finally that whole sequence ends with a shot of the river and the bridge in the downtown Laredo area, and overhearing Trump's narrative of why he needs to declare this emergency, while you're actually seeing the real border that he's talking about, and you're seeing that nothing is happening. Yeah. Right? So that's the opening of the movie. And then the ending of the movie is this drone shot right over the river in this most beautiful part off of Mines Road, like over off of the Muller Ranch. And it's this gorgeous like section of the river. Like it doesn't even look like it's Laredo, but it is Laredo. And we're hearing Trump basically saying, if you don't have good elections and if you don't have good border policy, then you don't have a country. Yeah. You know, and the reason that we end with that note is because what you're seeing visually is telling you the exact opposite. Yeah. You know, and so that's how I started with the movie. I had a clear ending, and I had a clear beginning, and I had a clear ending. I wanted to make those 2 points. And so then everything in between was to make those 2 moments make sense. And so that's kind of how I developed the story.
Fascinating. Yeah. Well, thank you, Carlos. That's very, I think we've had a really, really great conversation. Best of luck with your lawsuit against Greg Abbott. I know that he has it out for you. Yeah.
And which makes me happy. Which is great, like right? That's exciting. Like instead of scaring me, he's made me feel like, hey, I'm doing the right thing.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you brought up a very interesting point. That before Trump, not a whole lot of people were paying attention, and then when the gaze of the nation and the national media outlets and everything came down here, there were people to really convey the countervailing message to what these people have been spreading, which is that this area is violent and chaotic, and that's furthest from the truth.
Well, let me say this, Mora. It is and it isn't. The border's always been dangerous.
Well, yeah.
The border's always been dangerous, but we were comfortable with it because we know, hey, don't go here, don't go there, don't do this, don't do that. Yeah. We know, right? And when I say the border is dangerous, I mean the Mexican side of the border. Yeah. The American side of the border has never been dangerous, and it is not dangerous. It is safe. I mean, do we have stash houses? Yeah. Do we have incidents here and there where there's criminality? Of course, but that's every place. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? The thing is, the border has always been dangerous, in a sense, but it's part of why you accept it. Like it's part of why you love living here. It's like you go into Mexico in the old days before all of this cartels started to get very, very dangerous. And there was always this element of danger, but it was like, it's part of what you enjoyed. You know what I mean? It was like, I'm in a place that's different, you know? And Mexico can be itself. It doesn't have to be anything other than what it is, you know? And so the point is that, you know, once Trump came along and started to misrepresent what was really happening on the American side of the border, you know, and that's when we came to life. And I'm glad that he did that, and I'm glad that we came to life. And this has been, you know, a really great journey for our community.
No, it's not over yet, man.
Yeah, we're going to win. We will win. The border will win. Good, because the border's right.
I agree with you. But I mean, we're entering another election season where Trump is going to be the Republican nominee, and you know that his favorite issue is immigration and the border. So we're going to be getting a lot of attention in these next few months coming up. And so I'm sure we're going to be seeing a lot of you. Carlos, thank you so much, my friend. I always enjoy talking to you. We have great conversations. I think I want to continue this rhythm of having great conversations from here on. The elections are coming up. There's going to be a lot of obviously statewide elections, federal elections, and local elections that are going to be very controversial and very exciting. So stay tuned, everybody. We hope to be really busy in these next few months. Carlos, anything else you want to add before we sign off?
Just I want to thank you so much for inviting me on the show, and thank you for doing this very important work. I think this is a very important platform for people to come and talk and debate these issues. And you're a very intelligent person, and you have really great questions. So thank you.
Thank you, my brother. Appreciate it. On behalf of Frontera Radio, that about does it for us. May you have a pleasant rest of your day. I haven't done this in a while. Let me see which the right button is. I have to wear these.
Yeah, I know. We're all getting older. I met you when you were in your 30s, and now we're in our 40s.
On behalf of Frontera, may God bless you. May you have a good night.
Thank you, my friend.